Hello, and welcome to the screencast for Political Philosophy, Lehman College, Spring 2020. We've just finished Marx, and now we are moving on to a different critique of the classical liberal tradition. We're going to look at an article from philosopher Martha Nussbaum entitled Human Capabilities, Female Human Beings, Part 1. And what I mean by part 1, it's a very long article. It's about 30 pages, and we will look at about the first half in this part, and then we'll look at the second half as well as a selection from John Adams in the next set of videos in a couple of days. First, some background. I realize now that you'd have to pause and hand copy out these videos. There's a video on YouTube about Martha Nussbaum's overall approach to philosophy, and another one on economist Amartya Sen, who developed the capabilities approach in conjunction with Nussbaum. And I will put the links to these videos on Blackboard so you don't have to type them all out. So here are the big major developments in Western political philosophy that we have looked at and will look at for this whole semester. So by now you should be pretty familiar with classical liberalism, wherein the rationally self-interested man should have liberty to pursue their own goals or their own goods in life. Now, before we get too deep in the video, if you haven't had a lot of philosophical experience, you might not know what philosophers mean by human good. So, one of the big questions human beings often ask themselves is, how do I live a good life? How do I live a full life, a meaningful life, a happy life? And these are goods. These are human goods. And they can variously also be called goals. Your ultimate goal in life is to get to a kind of life that you think is good. And if you have liberty, if you have freedom, you should be able to have the liberty and the freedom to choose those goals for yourself, not have the government tell you what a good life is, not have any social institution tell you what it is. But you should have the freedom to choose yourself. Then we looked at the development of modern liberalism, which is a sort of branching off from classical liberalism, wherein, yes, your freedoms and your liberties should be preserved, but it's also the role of government to give their citizens a chance to flourish. And the classically liberal freedoms have led to something like an oligarchy, wherein it's the rich or the corporations, the economic forces that control most people's possibilities in life. And that isn't much liberty. So then we also saw Marxism, another critique on classical liberalism, which says that this kind of inequality will always persist as long as modern property relations exist. There will always be different socioeconomic classes, and they will always be struggling for freedom and power. Now, with the capabilities approach, and like I said, Nussbaum works with Sen, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist, to sort of try and patch up the flaws in the history of liberalism that have led to such injustice and inequality. Some of the flaws that they see in classical liberalism and many other people see as well. Next week will be our last philosopher that we look at in a substantial sort of way, and this is Rawls. We're going to sort of see how this capabilities approach dovetails or locks in with Rawls next week. But for now, all we need to think about is he was a man who tried to meld a rights approach. So this classical liberalism is a rights approach, saying you have the right to a lack of interference from government power, from other people, with a utilitarian approach. Now, a lot of people find a utilitarian approach very natural. We want to ease human suffering. Again, if you haven't had much of a philosophical background, if you are a utilitarian, like we talked about when we looked at Mill, you are concerned that the consequences of your actions, do they cause harm? Do they cause good? And what's the balance? So there's an introductory section. It's about 4 or 5 pages long, and Nussbaum uses that to try and explain one of the reasons she thought this project was important. She went to several conferences over several years and saw, alarmingly to her, that relativism as a way of looking at the world was a strong sort of trend in both academic thinking, academic debate, and in public policy debates. So if you have taken an introduction to philosophy or to moral philosophy, to ethics, you might have encountered this term relativism. And as human beings like to do, they try to understand a concept and its opposite. So sometimes relativism is paired against universalism, sometimes it's paired against essentialism, sometimes objectivism. The idea is when you're a relativist, you don't think there's one fact of the matter about whatever section of the world you're talking about. So if you see somebody commit a behavior, one person might say that that behavior is morally okay, and another person who grew up in another place or another time might say that that action isn't okay. And we can see how things that we view as appropriate behavior does change over time. We could take big things like abolition of slavery, or little things like what's appropriate to wear for both men and women. So the relativist takes this approach. It says, well, how can we really say who's right and who's wrong? It's not like there's some scientific law of morality that anybody's ever discovered. And there's certainly no lack of evidence that the world has been full of people trying to force their morality on other people. There are long histories of violence, exploitation, colonization, and many, many other power abuses, often couched in the idea that the conqueror has the truth of what it means to live a good life, what it means to be a good human being, what it means to be civilized. In Marx, we saw that there is a valid criticism that Western philosophy claims that it develops these eternal truths even while they are historically situated and committing injustices and propagating inequality. So the relativist position, the idea that we shouldn't be quick to judge other people's ways of life because we're always coming from our own perspective, it has some solid motivations. People don't want to jump in and make automatic moral judgments of other cultures. And there's a technical term that Nussbaum mentions that you may not be familiar with, the episteme. And this sort of touches on a big divide in Western philosophy that we haven't had much cause or reason to look at this semester. We are within the tradition of what's called analytical philosophy. All of the people that we looked at are, for the most part, analytical philosophers. But after Immanuel Kant in the 1700s, there did tend to be two schools of thinking in Western philosophy, the analytics that I've just mentioned, and the continentals, which have a different tradition. And of course, there's a ton of overlap, and the boundaries are not clear cut, but the episteme comes from a philosopher who is firmly rooted in the continental tradition. And so we don't get too far afield. I put a definition we can use of the episteme for our purposes. Think about it as your framework. You're born into a culture, a way of relating socially, a way of thinking certain ideas are true and certain ideas aren't true. Certain institutions are good at telling truth and other ones aren't. You can think of a more religious society or a more scientific society. It's a framework. An episteme is the framework that you're born into, and all of it shapes your own personal worldview, including who you think you are, the possibilities you believe are open to you, what you think is true, what you think is false, what you value, or what you think is important. This is the episteme you're born into. And moral relativists and knowledge relativists say, and even political relativists for our focus on political philosophy, say that other cultures have different epistemes. And we can't even begin to understand it because we weren't born and raised inside of it. We can't presume to make moral judgments about other epistemes. You might be wondering why we're talking about morality in a political philosophy course. So we have been tracing, of course, the development of Western political philosophy. And for the early beginnings, and I mean a long period of time, several centuries, political philosophers tried to reach these truths, these eternal truths about human nature, about what political system would be the best political system forever and always for everybody. And they did it by trying to use reason alone, apart from morality. But it doesn't really seem that even attempting to do that, it's possible to eliminate moral judgments and moral evaluations. So when a philosopher uses the word moral judgment or moral evaluation, the most basic thing that they mean is that we all have this idea of how the world ought to be, or what it means to be a good person, how ought you to behave, and what behavior is prohibited to you if you want to be a good person. And when you make a judgment like that, you're not judging a fact in the same way that you might judge a physics equation or a measurement. Those things are either true or false, and that's what makes a fact a fact. When you make a judgment or an evaluation, you are putting your value onto the world. So when you decide something about how the political structure should be organized, it seems almost impossible to take away these kinds of judgments. The kinds of evidence you're going to use are always going to say, well, this is the way the world should be or ought to be, and this is why. We wouldn't even necessarily want to take all moral evaluations outside of our political and social structure, because we do think human beings ought to have certain things in an ideal world. There are a ton of pretty strong objections against pure moral relativism, even though it comes from the right motivations, in that we don't want to be imperialist, we don't want to be colonialist, we don't want to use our power to abuse other people. Even still, it seems like we have way more overlap with people in other cultures than we do differences. If we had such differences that we couldn't even communicate our values with one another. We wouldn't even bother trying to explain things to one another because reasons mean nothing if you grew outside of the episteme. So that main objection is that we all have more in common than we do differences. We all use reason to understand one another. And if the world was purely morally relative, we'd never be able to progress. We'd have to look back at the history of slavery in America and say it was just a different time and a different place. We can't judge them. But no, that doesn't capture what we really think about the world or the institution of slavery. So there must be some aspect to morality that is not relative. I'm a little worried that my video has frozen, so I'm going to pause here, and I might have a part A and a part B.